Dewanna was not driving her car. Her son was driving her car, and the allegation from law enforcement was that her son did not use a traffic signal when exiting a roundabout. Okay, so the allegation was he didn't turn on his turn signal. In Kansas, there isn't a turn signal statute for exiting a roundabout. So it's unclear whether you have to use a turn signal when you're exiting a roundabout. And for anyone who's ever gone through a roundabout, it can get confusing. Are you supposed to put on your right signal? Are you supposed to put on your left signal? If there's another car coming, how are you supposed to show them which way you're going? Well, the law doesn't say. So Dewanna's son, again, it's alleged that he didn't use his turn signal. And when he didn't, law enforcement activated their lights, basically turned on the police car, and eventually pulled Dewanna's son over.
Americans are capable of achieving extraordinary things when they have the freedom and opportunity to do so. This is American Potential. And here's your host, Jeff Crank.
Well, thanks for joining us on another episode of American Potential. Appreciate you being with us. Look, how crazy would it sound if you heard about someone having their car, cash, or other personal items being seized by law enforcement and you aren't charged with a crime? This happens all around the country, and law enforcement uses something called civil asset forfeiture to do it. So how do you get your property back if you weren't charged with a crime? Well, on today's episode, we're going to share the story of one lady who had her vehicle seized by using civil asset forfeiture, but was able to get it back because she got in contact with the Kansas Justice Institute. Now, because of this lady's story, there was a bill passed in Kansas to make changes to civil asset forfeiture. I want to welcome Sam MacRoberts, who is General Counsel and Litigation Director for the Kansas Justice Institute. Sam, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So let's first talk a little bit about civil asset forfeiture. Explain to folks, that's kind of a strange term that's probably a little bit foreign to a lot of folks. So explain what that is.
It's really strange. And just listening to your intro reminds me how strange it is. It truly is when the government can take your car or your cash or your property without ever even accusing you of a crime. And that's what happened to our client, Dewanna Goodridge. It's this really old, convoluted practice that law enforcement has seized on, no pun intended, to be able to take somebody's property. And there are constant court challenges around the country every year about forfeiture. And as you mentioned, Kansas just took a really important step to reform what we think is a really abusive practice.
Yeah. So give us an example. It doesn't have to be Dewanna's example, but if you want to give us an example of how maybe civil asset forfeiture might come into play in a case.
Two classic examples. The first one, a person pulls cash out of their bank account. They want to fly across the country to purchase maybe a work van or anything really. And what happens is their money goes through a scanner at the airport. Law enforcement sees it, and they then take that cash saying, well, it must be connected to something illegal. So now you prove that it's not illegal, and then maybe we'll give it back. The second example, and this happens in Kansas, from our perspective routinely, somebody's driving through the state, they have cash, the government can uncover that cash from the car, and then they seize it. And then again, you have to prove that cash had nothing to do with a crime.
So there's no requirement that there has to be a preponderance of evidence or any evidence at all that it was used in a crime, or they just seize it?
So great question. It varies from state to state and also varies from the state level to the federal level. In Kansas, what happens is as long as the government can make a credible argument that there's probable cause that a crime or even an offense has taken place, then they can seize cash. And so probable cause is a really low standard. It's It is incredibly low. You don't typically have to get in front of a judge to establish probable cause. What the law enforcement officer does is they'll put together an affidavit or some other document, doesn't even have to be under oath in some instances. And they say, well, we think that cash has to do, for example, something with drugs or some other type of crime. They take that cash. Then in Kansas, before these changes happened, they could sit on it for a long period of time. And for a lot of people, they just didn't have the means or the wherewithal to be able to fight the government to get that cash back.
Yeah. So would you say they have to have probable cause? So maybe give me an example of what probable cause would be in a situation where they can seize civil asset forfeiture.
So I think what is so problematic from our perspective is probable cause can be essentially anything that the government thinks. They get to establish what probable cause is. So take, for example, a person who is driving on the interstate. They're going from Colorado to Missouri and they're driving through Kansas. If a person gets pulled over by the highway patrol, for example, this can't establish probable cause. An officer can swear under oath, well, that person looked nervous. He or she was sweating. They made furtive movements, meaning they were acting suspiciously. And during this traffic stop, I asked them a few questions. Their answers didn't make sense to me. I saw cash sitting there. They were coming from a known drug corridor, Colorado, because that is a state that has legalized marijuana. They're going to Missouri. We know that Missouri has marijuana. And so because we saw that they were nervous, that they were sweating, that they couldn't follow all of our directions, we have probable cause to believe that cash is somehow connected with a drug crime. And from our perspective, that does not establish probable cause. That's not probable cause at all. That's a fairly routine instance. I have seen people get pulled over. They get nervous. When people are interacting with law enforcement, that's what happens. They have a hard time breathing sometimes. Not everybody wants to deal with a highway patrolman in the middle of the state.
Yeah.
And so for all of those things like that in our view is not probable cause, but for a lot of law enforcement officers, that is probable cause. And then when you get in front of a judge, it's very difficult for a judge to maybe overturn that officer's determination. So I could see a judge saying, well, what do you want me to do? I wasn't there. I didn't see this. The officer is saying that the person was nervous. We'll sort this out later. Mm-hmm. And the problem is then a person is without their cash during that period of time.
Mm-hmm. So they don't have, it wouldn't have to be to have probable cause. It sounds like it wouldn't have to be like they also had an email from a known drug dealer in Missouri in that case. That's not even something that has to be there for them to get probable cause is what you're saying.
That's right. The standard is so low, the government does not need an email. They don't need to corroborate their hunches or their suspicions. They basically get to write it out. And then that is, in a lot of instances, sufficient.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. By the way, let's talk a little bit about what the Kansas Justice Institute does.
So we are a free law firm. What we do is we fight back against government overreach. If we think the government has done something wrong, or we think that they're violating someone's rights, we are prepared and we do sue to vindicate a person's constitutional rights. We do more than just forfeiture cases. We filed First Amendment lawsuits. That's free speech. We have filed Fourth Amendment lawsuits. That's the search and seizure clause. And so our whole goal is to protect a person's constitutional rights. Again, we're free. We don't charge our client any money to represent them. Our whole existence is devoted to fighting what we think is unfair from the government and fighting back against unconstitutional overreach by the government. Mm-hmm. And quite frankly, that happens in forfeiture cases quite often.
So let's talk about this case specifically a little bit. Can you share what happened to your client, Dewanna Goodridge?
Sure. So we represent Dewanna Goodridge. Dewanna was not driving her car. Her son was driving her car. And the allegation from law enforcement was that her son did not use a traffic signal when exiting a roundabout. Okay. So the allegation was he didn't turn on his turn signal. In Kansas, there isn't a turn signal statute for exiting a roundabout. So it's unclear whether you have to use a turn signal when you're exiting a roundabout. Okay. And for anyone who's ever gone through a roundabout, it can get confusing. Are you supposed to put on your right signal? Are you supposed to put on your left signal? If there's another car coming, how are you supposed to show them which way you're going? Well, the law doesn't say. Mm-hmm. So Dewanna's son, again, it's alleged that he didn't use his turn signal. And when he didn't, law enforcement activated their lights, basically turned on the police car, and eventually pulled Dewanna's son over. At the scene where they pulled over the son, Dewanna ended up showing up and was telling law enforcement, hey, that's my car. Law enforcement took a dog, ran it around the car. When they used the dog, he allegedly alerted, meaning he made some sort of signal indicating that some sort of substance was in the car. Okay. At that point, law enforcement went into the car. They said that they found basically marijuana crumbs. So something almost resembling nothing, right? When you're talking about marijuana crumbs, there's really nothing in the car. They didn't recover any marijuana crumbs. They just said that they saw it. And on that basis, they took Dewanna's car. Now, Dewanna wasn't in the car at that time. There was no connection or really any reason to take Dewanna's car because she didn't do anything wrong. And even if Dewanna's son did something wrong, in our view, it's pretty excessive for the government to take that car, especially because it was Dewanna who was paying for it. It was Dewanna who bought the car. And that really was kind of the beginning of this nightmare for Dewanna.
Mm-hmm. So she lost her car. How did that affect her life?
It was really difficult for her. Dewanna is a hardworking lady in Junction City, Kansas. She worked incredibly hard to be able to buy that car and make payments on it. And so for her to lose that car, it made life incredibly difficult for her. It was the only car of hers that was reliable. It was the only one that if she needed to get out of town, she could use. It was the car that her son used to help kind of move grandkids around. And so for her, it just made life incredibly difficult. And I kind of think about, I've got 3 kids. If we were to lose the family car, I just don't even know how we could handle that situation. It'd be a lot of time off from work. It'd be frustrating, especially knowing that we didn't do anything wrong. And I think mentally, it's really hard to convey how frustrating it was for Dewanna. Here she is. Again, she worked so hard for that car. She didn't do anything wrong, and then the government takes it from her. Yeah. So in addition to even just the practical part of it, I mean, it's a lot to bear on your shoulders to have that happen.
Yeah. Was her son charged with the crime?
Yeah, her son was charged, and I think it's still currently pending. But I don't believe he was charged with a drug crime.
Mm-hmm. How was she feeling when you got to talk to her for the first time?
You know, I think she was still really frustrated. She was frustrated that, like I said, the government took her car. But at the same time, I think she felt relieved that here we were able to step in and fight back against this system. And I think that's how a lot of people view forfeiture in Kansas, and especially in the Junction City, Gary County area. Gary County and Junction City use forfeiture, in our view, prolifically. And so it is common knowledge that it is used, and they will use it. And for a lot of people, they can't afford an attorney. They can't afford to take off from work. They can't go into court to try to fight against the government. And the deck is completely stacked against individuals. So I think at the beginning when we were talking to Dewanna, it was hard for her to really think that, hey, we might be able to win this case. And eventually we got her car back for her.
Yeah. So once you got the car back, you then wanted to take this as an example and maybe get some laws passed in Kansas or change the law in Kansas. How did the case affect this new law that was passed?
So in Kansas, the legislature has been thinking about how to change forfeiture for about the last 4 or 5 years. And from about 2019 on, every time we would go in front of the legislature, there would be individual legislators who would say, hey, like, tell us what's happening in the communities. Let's hear some stories about this. We want to know how this is impacting individuals. And I think for us, we were able to share Dewanna's story and help explain to people, this is what happens in a forfeiture case. So in a lot of ways, Dewanna's case was pretty emblematic of forfeiture. This happens to a lot of people in Kansas. But at the same time, Dewanna's case was pretty unique because she got her car back, and that rarely happens in Kansas. There was a study done that I think it was about 90% of people who've had things seized from them don't get it back. 90%. And so that, I think, is a really telling statistic. It's that the government made it so incredibly difficult to get things back. People just didn't even try.
Yeah.
But here Dewanna did.
So the 90% that you're using, that number, that's 90% of people who were not convicted of a crime, or is that 90% of the people who had something seized?
Yeah, it was 90% of people who had things seized, and there are other statistics dealing with the people who weren't charged with crimes.
Yeah.
And I think that that's really important to kind of drill down into those statistics, because there are a lot of people who haven't been convicted of crimes, who weren't even charged with a crime, who still had their property taken from them. And when I try to explain to people about forfeiture, and I tell them, like, they don't believe me at first. They say, oh, there's no way. Like, the government can't take something from you unless they convict you of a crime. And I'm like, no, that's absolutely not true. And then I tell stories, true stories, like Dewanna's case, that in fact, the government does take things from people where Dewanna didn't do anything wrong, and they still took her car.
Yeah. I mean, what about the takings clause? Does this have any, does that apply here?
Yeah, we wish it would. There are a lot of court cases that basically talk about takings, and there really isn't a lot of fertile ground to bring a takings claim in the context of forfeiture, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, obviously, I think most people believe that if somebody's committing a crime and they were using assets in the commission of a crime, for instance, they were running drugs and drugs were illegal, and they had them in the car, and it was their car, that it's probably reasonable for law enforcement to seize that car, sell that as an asset, and pay for restitution to victims or the system, whatever. But this is different. And explain how this. I mean, I think you've explained it, but explain again how this is different. And can you craft a law? And it sounds like maybe you have in Kansas, where both of those things can happen, where the police can still do their job, but you don't have these kinds of abuses where people get a car or property seized when they really weren't doing anything in the commission of a crime.
So law enforcement, when they get up to talk about forfeiture, they say this is an important tool to be able to disrupt criminal enterprises. And when they're trying to justify forfeiture, they are painting this picture almost like Miami Vice. I don't know if you remember that back in the 80s. We would see these speedboats carrying, massive amount of cocaine back and forth through Florida. And then, law enforcement would seize the boat and sell it, just like you're talking about, things like that. But maybe that's how it started out, but that's certainly not what's going on throughout America. And it's not what's going on in Kansas. The vast majority of forfeiture cases in Kansas and elsewhere are just like Dewanna's case. It is an incredibly low dollar amount for things like cars and cash, and it is not disrupting criminal enterprises. And so I think, law enforcement has a good argument for why criminal forfeiture and civil forfeiture can work in certain instances. But what has happened over the years is it became so incredibly broad that the government's able to take somebody's car without proving anything. And that's really kind of the meat of the problem, or the crux of the problem, is then you've got people who perhaps are getting paid in cash, or they just cashed their paycheck, and then it gets seized. And then because the dollar figure is so low, like let's say, for example, you get $1,000 taken from you, you're never going to be able to find a lawyer and pay them enough money to get that cash back. No lawyer is going to take that case because it just doesn't make sense to do it. And so for a lot of people, they just give up. There's no reason to go into court and miss time from work and be able to pay, because they can't, an attorney to get $1,000 back. And that's the problem. That's what we're seeing in Kansas. That's what the data shows. And so that's really where we have to kind of drill down and craft a law that makes sense. So if law enforcement thinks they have to use this to disrupt criminal enterprise, then they can use it for those, not going after people like Dewanna, not going after everyday Kansans. And so, the legislature just passed forfeiture reform in Kansas unanimously. There wasn't a single vote against forfeiture reform in Kansas. Mm-hmm. That's incredible. That shows, at least to me, that forfeiture is a serious problem. It was a serious problem for a long time. And maybe it started off with good intentions, but that's not where it was today.
Yeah.
And so I think one of the things when you're talking about crafting a law, what are ways to do it? We're going to see whether or not this version makes sense, whether it really does curb kind of the most abusive aspects of forfeiture. And I think this is a really good start. One of the things you talked about at the very beginning was the proof. Like, what level of proof does the government need to establish before they can take something? My personal view is that the government has to convict someone first. They have to be able to prove their case beyond all reasonable doubt in a criminal court of law before they can take someone's property. Now, the legislature didn't go that route, but they did increase the burden of proof to clear and convincing evidence, which is much stronger than most civil cases. So what they've done, they made it harder for the government to be able to take someone's property just by increasing the burden of proof.
Yeah. Okay. So you're going to figure this out. When does this law go into? Is it in effect now, or did it?
It goes in July 1st.
July 1st. Okay.
Yep. July 1st.
Yeah.
And so we think that what's going to happen is, and there's a number of reforms that the legislature passed. It wasn't just increasing the burden of proof. There are other things like now the government's going to have to fill out a probable cause affidavit. It's going to go to a judge. A judge is now going to review whether or not there's probable cause to basically start this forfeiture proceeding. There's a really important component here, which is for if you challenge the government and you prevail, then the government has to pay your attorney's fees. And we think that's really important for people who have those low dollar cases, because now it might incentivize lawyers to be able to take on those cases and fight back, especially on those cases that the government really shouldn't have been bringing to begin with.
I do think it's fascinating that you were able to get the entire legislature to pass this bill. That's quite a feat.
It was really it was such a cool moment to kind of see where this bill ended up after starting in 2019. So, like I said, for about 5 years, we were working with AFP and others on crafting some really solid common sense reforms. And at the very beginning, it was difficult to convince the legislature that there was something wrong. And then every year, the legislature is really interesting. They started to be like, oh, okay, yeah, I have heard about that. And they would talk to their constituents. They would hear what's going on in the state. And I think the more and more we were able to have this important conversation with them, the more willing they were to make changes. And I can't remember in the last 5 years seeing a unanimous vote on such a serious piece of legislation.
Yeah. Yeah, that's impressive. Well, we'll see where it goes from here. How long had you and others been working on getting a bill like this passed?
So there have been some changes over the years to asset forfeiture. One really important thing, I think it was in 2018, there was a requirement that the law enforcement had to basically explain where the money was going, how often they were seizing from people, what the forfeitures were. And that led to basically the database that I referenced earlier that showed that 90% of people didn't get their property back. And I think for the legislature, that database showed them that there is an ongoing problem. So all of that's to say, kind of started off a little bit before 2018. And then in 2019, that's when things really started to build momentum until this legislative session.
Yeah. Now, Miss Goodridge, she's got her car back, her life back on track?
She's got her car back, her life's back on track. It was one of those things that it was so cool to be able to go in there in court and get the car back. And now I will say this, She didn't get her car back that day. She was in court, but she got it back the following Monday. She was a little upset she didn't get it back that Friday like we were hoping. But at the end of the day, she got it back. And so, and we still stay in touch. We talk about what's going on in Junction City. And I'm so happy for her. Not many people can stand up to law enforcement, especially when they've been wronged, and win. That Dewanna won against law enforcement to get her car back.
Yeah. Well, Sam, I appreciate you joining us and telling Dewanna's story and the great work that you guys have done on this. Again, it's great to know that there can be something crafted that law enforcement can still continue to do their job. And it sounds like the legislature felt that was true, that there were abuses. They wanted to fix those abuses, but still not hinder law enforcement. And so that's a win-win for the citizens and for the government, I suppose, coming together and getting that law passed. So congratulations on that.
Thank you. I agree.
Yeah. Okay. Hey, great. Thanks for joining us. What an interesting topic. Not a lot of people, I think, know about civil asset forfeiture. So thanks for joining us. Thanks for listening to this episode of American Potential. Again, you can catch us either on YouTube, our YouTube channel. You can watch us in video form, every podcast episode released on the YouTube channel, as well as anywhere where you get your podcasts. You can listen to us on that platform. Feel free to send me an email. Love to hear from you. Jeff@AmericanPotential.com. And you can also like us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube as well. So we'd love to have you do that. Thanks for joining us on American Potential.
Thank you for listening to American Potential. You may listen to more stories from Americans working every day to expand freedom and opportunity in their communities by visiting AmericanPotential.com.